turret loomed against the night sky, its jagged silhouette cutting through the fog like the jagged edge of a knife. Emily stood at its base, her flashlight casting feeble beams across the worn stone staircase spiraling upward. The tower's heavy silence was unnerving. Even the ever-present wind seemed reluctant to intrude. Her footsteps echoed as she ascended, each step filling her with a growing sense of dread. The others had begged her not to go, especially after the events in the bleeding corridor and Evelyn's cryptic plea. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay here, in the turret that had been Lady Isabella's prison centuries ago. She reached the landing, her breath hitching as the narrow staircase gave way to the small, circular room at the top. The air was colder here, almost icy, and it carried a faint metallic tang. Her flashlight illuminated the barren walls and the narrow slit of a window, through which the moon cast a pale beam of light across the floor. The turret was as empty as it had been the last time she'd visited, yet the atmosphere felt different, thicker, heavier, as though the air itself resisted her presence. The first grip, Emily stepped cautiously into the room, her flashlight beam sweeping over the stone floor. She crouched near the window, tracing her fingers along the initials carved into the sill. I.S. Lady Isabella, Emily murmured, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. As she knelt there, a sudden gust of wind tore through the room. Though the window was far too small for such a force, her flashlight flickered, and she felt a sharp chill against the back of her neck, as though someone were breathing down her spine. Then, without warning, an invisible force gripped her throat. Emily gasped, dropping her flashlight as her hands flew to her neck. There was nothing there. No hands, no rope. Yet the pressure was undeniable. It squeezed tighter and tighter, cutting off her air and forcing her to her knees. She clawed at the empty space, panic surging through her as her vision blurred. "Let me go," she choked out, her voice barely more than a rasp. The grip released abruptly, and Emily collapsed to the floor, coughing and gasping for air. She clutched her neck, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The room was silent once more, but the malevolent energy lingered, an unspoken warning that she wasn't welcome here. The writhing shadows. Emily fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she retrieved it. The beam wavered as she swept it across the room, and her heart sank as she noticed the shadows. They moved. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, her own fear playing tricks on her. But as she stared, she realized the shadows were shifting, writhing along the walls like living things. They had no source, no figures or objects to cast them. Yet they moved with purpose, their shapes elongating and contracting in unnatural ways. "Who's there?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The shadows didn't respond. Instead, they seemed to converge, coalescing into a single, amorphous mass in the corner of the room. It pulsed and quivered, its edges fraying like smoke, and Emily's stomach turned as she felt its gaze, if it had eyes, fixed on her. A whisper echoed through the room, faint and distorted. "Leave." Emily's grip on the flashlight tightened. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to know what happened here. I need to know about Evelyn." The shadow writhed violently, its form shifting into jagged, spindly shapes that lashed out toward her. The whisper grew louder, angrier. "Leave or suffer." The haunting vision. Before Emily could move, her surroundings began to change. The cold stone walls of the turret blurred and faded, replaced by a dimly lit chamber that felt both familiar and alien. She was no longer in the present. The turret was now furnished, its floor covered in a faded rug, and a small cot pushed against the wall. A frail woman sat on the cot, her hands clutching a bundle of cloth to her chest. Her hair was dark and wild, her face pale and gaunt, but her eyes burned with a desperate determination. "Lady Isabella," Emily whispered, realizing she was witnessing a moment from the past. The woman didn't seem to hear her. She rocked back and forth, whispering softly to the bundle. "Hush, my darling," she murmured. "He won't take you from me. I won't let him." A loud bang echoed through the room as the door flew open. A man entered, his presence commanding and cold. Emily recognized him immediately from the descriptions in Michael Shaw's journal. This was the man himself, the architect of the castle's horrors. "You have no right to keep him from me," Michael said, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped toward Isabella, his hand outstretched. Isabella shrank back, clutching the bundle tighter. "You'll never have him," she hissed. "I'd rather see him dead than let you twist him into something monstrous." Michael's face twisted with fury, and he lunged for her. Isabella screamed, and the vision dissolved, the sounds of their struggle fading into the cold silence of the present. The voice of the tower. Emily was back in the turret, her flashlight beam shaking as she tried to process what she'd just seen. The shadows had retreated, but their presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. The whisper returned, softer now, almost pleading. "Help her." "Help who?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. "Isabella? Evelyn?" The whisper didn't answer. Instead, the window rattled violently, the glass cracking as the wind howled through the narrow opening. Emily stepped back, shielding her face as shards of glass rained down onto the floor. When the wind died down, the room was silent again. Emily turned toward the wall opposite the window and froze. Words had appeared on the stone, scratched into the surface with jagged, uneven lines. They spelled out a single phrase. "Find the key. The escape." Emily didn't wait to see what would happen next. She bolted from the turret, her flashlight guiding her down the narrow staircase. The walls seemed to close in as she descended, the air growing heavier with each step. By the time she reached the bottom, she was gasping for breath, her legs trembling. Connor, Alice, and Maggie were waiting for her in the hallway. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Connor asked, his voice urgent. Emily hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She glanced back at the staircase, half expecting the shadows to follow her. But the doorway remained empty. "The turret," she said finally, her voice trembling. "It showed me something. Isabella and Michael, they fought over Evelyn. And then the walls. They told me to find a key." "A key?" Maggie asked, her brow furrowing. "To what?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's important." Alice crossed her arms, her expression tight. "This castle keeps asking for things. Help Evelyn find a key. What if it's all just a trap?" Emily looked at her, the weight of the vision pressing heavily on her shoulders. "What if it's not?" Malevolent guide. The air in Ballygally Castle felt heavier than ever as the group gathered in the library. Emily had just finished recounting her harrowing experience in the turret, her voice still trembling from the memory of invisible hands gripping her throat. Connor sat quietly beside her, the journal of Michael Shaw open on the table in front of him. His eyes were fixed on the pages, but there was something different about his demeanor, something unnervingly still. "We need to take this seriously," Maggie said, pacing back and forth. "The castle's not just haunted, it's alive. Every step we take feeds into its power." Alice scoffed, leaning against the bookshelf with her arms crossed. "Alive? It's a bunch of rocks, Maggie." "Creepy rocks, sure, but rocks. Tell that to the bleeding walls," Emily shot back, her voice sharper than intended. She turned to Connor, hoping for his input, but he hadn't moved since they sat down. "Connor, what do you think?" Connor didn't answer. His gaze remained locked on the journal, his lips moving soundlessly. "Connor," Emily asked again, placing a hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, snapping his head up to look at her. For a moment, his eyes seemed darker, the usual warmth replaced by something cold and distant. His lips curled into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're not asking the right questions," he said, his voice low and measured. "The castle isn't trying to harm us. It's testing us." Maggie stopped pacing, her brow furrowing. "Testing us? For what?" Connor's smile widened. "For worthiness. To see who deserves to uncover its secrets. The first signs." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Connor's tone was unnerving, his words laced with a confidence that felt alien. Emily leaned closer, trying to read his expression. "Connor," she said carefully, "are you feeling okay?" He tilted his head, his smile faltering. Better than I've ever felt, actually. The journal, it's speaking to me. Michael Shaw left clues. Breadcrumbs leading to the truth. Breadcrumbs, Alice repeated, her skepticism obvious. Connor, you sound like you've lost it. But Connor ignored her. He rose from his seat, clutching the journal tightly, and began walking toward the door. His steps were deliberate, almost mechanical, and his shoulders were tense. Where are you going? Emily asked, hurrying after him. To the truth, he replied, his voice distant. It's calling. I have to follow. Maggie moved to block his path, her hand outstretched. Connor, wait. Whatever's happening to you, we need to stop and think about this. Connor stopped abruptly, his head snapping toward her with an unnatural quickness. His lips moved, and a guttural string of words spilled out. Words none of them could understand. The sound sent a chill down Emily's spine, as though the syllables carried a power they couldn't comprehend. What the hell was that? Alice whispered, her voice trembling. Connor didn't answer. Instead, he pushed past Maggie, his strength surprising for someone usually so mild-mannered. Emily exchanged a panicked glance with the others before following him down the corridor. The descent. The castle seemed to respond to Connor's movements, its halls growing darker and narrower as he led them deeper into its depths. The once familiar corridors felt alien now, their stone walls twisting unnaturally. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of damp earth and decay filled their nostrils. Connor, stop! Emily called, her voice echoing off the walls. But he didn't stop. His pace quickened, his movements growing more erratic. He began mumbling again, his voice low and guttural, the words flowing like a chant. The sound seemed to reverberate through the walls, and Emily swore she heard whispers answering him. Maggie grabbed Emily's arm, her face pale. He's not in control anymore, she said. Something's taken hold of him. Then we need to snap him out of it, Emily replied, her resolve hardening. We can't just let him go like this. Alice, who had been trailing behind them, groaned in frustration. This is insane. We should leave him and get out of here while we still can. No one's leaving him, Emily snapped. We're in this together. The hidden chamber. Connor came to an abrupt stop in front of a heavy wooden door at the end of the corridor. The door was carved with intricate symbols, similar to those Emily had seen in the turret, and its surface was blackened with age. Without hesitation, Connor pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was small and circular, its walls lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, rusted tools, cracked vials, and fragments of old parchment. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, upon which sat a tarnished silver key. Connor approached the pedestal, his movements jerky and unnatural. The journal slipped from his grasp, landing on the floor with a soft thud as he reached for the key. Connor, don't! Emily shouted, rushing forward. As his fingers closed around the key, the room shuddered violently, the air filling with a low, resonant hum. The shadows on the walls writhed, their forms growing larger and more distinct. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight beam catching glimpses of twisted faces and clawed hands. Connor turned to face them, the key held tightly in his hand. His expression was vacant, his eyes dark and hollow. When he spoke, his voice was layered, as though another voice were speaking through him. This is where it begins, he said, his tone cold and detached. And where it will end, the confrontation. Maggie stepped forward, her hand outstretched. Connor, listen to me. You're being manipulated. The castle is using you. Connor tilted his head, the faintest hint of a smirk on his lips. You think you can stop this? He asked. You think you can change what's already been set in motion? Emily felt her chest tighten. Connor, please. Whatever's happening to you, we can fix it. Just give me the key. Connor's gaze snapped to her, his expression shifting into something cruel. You think you're the hero, don't you? He spat. Always searching, always digging, but you'll only find death. Before Emily could respond, Connor lunged toward her. His movements were fast and inhuman, his hand reaching for her throat. Maggie intercepted him, shoving him back with surprising strength. Get out of here! Maggie shouted, "Take the journal and go." But Emily began. "Go," Maggie repeated, her voice firm. Emily hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the fallen journal and pulling Alice toward the door. The last thing she saw as they fled was Maggie standing her ground, her hand raised as though casting a barrier between Connor and the others. The aftermath. Emily and Alice didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the library. They collapsed into chairs, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. "What just happened?" Alice demanded, her voice shaking. "Connor, he wasn't himself. That wasn't him." Emily opened the journal, flipping through its pages with trembling hands. She stopped at a passage near the end, her eyes scanning the faded text. "The key is both a weapon and a curse. To wield it is to invite the shadow into your soul." "He's possessed," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The castle's using him to get what it wants." Alice shook her head. "Then how do we stop it? How do we save him?" Emily looked at the journal, her resolve hardening. "We figure out what the castle wants, and we end this." Night of terror. The stillness of the night at Ballygally Castle was broken by a sound that hadn't been heard in centuries. The tolling of the tower bell. Its deep, resonant chime reverberated through the castle's ancient halls, shaking dust from the rafters and causing the very stone to tremble. Emily jolted awake in her bed, her heart pounding. She sat upright, straining to listen as the echo of the bell faded, only to be replaced by another, louder toll. The sound was unnatural, as though it came from the depths of the earth rather than the sky. "That can't be," she murmured to herself. The tower bell had been defunct for over a century. Its mechanism rusted and its rope rotted away. Yet the sound was undeniable, loud, heavy, and foreboding. Alice stirred in the bed beside hers, rubbing her eyes groggily. "What the hell is that?" she muttered. Emily didn't answer. She threw on a jacket and grabbed her flashlight, her instincts pulling her toward the source of the sound. The bell tolled again, its vibrations rattling the window panes. "Emily, don't!" Alice called after her, but Emily was already out the door, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. A gathering in the hall. By the time Emily reached the base of the tower, the others were already there. Maggie stood with her arms crossed, her face pale but determined, while Liam hovered nervously nearby, clutching a lantern. Connor was nowhere to be seen. "The bell," Emily said breathlessly. "It's ringing." "We noticed," Maggie replied dryly. Her eyes darted toward the staircase leading up to the tower. "Something's happening." Alice arrived moments later, her expression a mix of fear and frustration. "Are you all insane? You're just going to march up there after hearing that?" "We don't have a choice," Emily said firmly. "If the bell is ringing, it's for a reason. Something, or someone, wants us to go." "Exactly," Alice shot back. "Which is why we shouldn't go." Before anyone could argue further, the bell tolled again, louder and more insistent. The sound sent a shiver through Emily's body, and she exchanged a tense glance with Maggie. "We're going," Maggie said. She turned to Liam and Alice. "Stay here if you want, but whatever's happening in that tower is tied to the castle's curse. If we're going to end this, we need to confront it." With that, she started up the staircase, her lantern casting flickering shadows on the walls. Emily hesitated for only a moment before following. The ascent. The climb to the top of the tower was steep and treacherous, the narrow stone steps slick with moisture. The air grew colder with each step, and the tolling of the bell seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Emily's flashlight flickered as she climbed, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. She felt a growing sense of unease, as though unseen eyes were watching her every move. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Maggie nodded grimly. "The energy's stronger here. The tower's a focal point for whatever's haunting this place." Liam, who had reluctantly decided to follow, spoke up from behind them. "Maybe we should turn back. This doesn't feel right." "No one forced you to come," Alice muttered, her tone sharper than usual. But even she clung to the banister, her knuckles white. When they finally reached the top, the tolling of the bell ceased abruptly, plunging the room into an eerie silence. group stepped into the circular chamber at the tower's peak, their breath visible in the frigid air. The manifestation. The room was empty save for the ancient bell, its massive frame suspended from rusted iron supports. The bell itself was tarnished and cracked, its surface marked with strange, angular symbols. A faint glow emanated from the cracks, pulsing like a heartbeat. "What's making it ring?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the shadows in the room began to shift. They pulled together, stretching and twisting, until they formed a towering, humanoid figure. Its edges were undefined, its form constantly shifting like smoke caught in a storm. Two glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, their fiery gaze fixed on the group. Emily took an involuntary step back, her flashlight beam shaking. "What is that?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, and the air in the room grew heavy and oppressive. The bell tolled once more, the sound deafening, and the room seemed to warp and bend around the shadow. Maggie stepped forward, her hand raised. "We're not here to harm you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We want to help. Tell us what you want." The shadow figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of overlapping whispers, each one dripping with malice. "Time," it said. "You have stolen our time." The confrontation. Emily felt the weight of the words settle over her, and she struggled to comprehend their meaning. "We don't understand," she said. "What do you mean?" The figure stepped closer, its form towering over them. "Your kind takes what does not belong," it hissed. "You disturb the past. You disrupt the future. Time demands a reckoning." The bell tolled again, and the room shook violently. The floor cracked beneath their feet, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. Emily grabbed onto the nearest wall for support, her heart racing. "What do we do?" Liam shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Maggie closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer or chant. The bell's glow intensified, and the shadow figure raised its hands, its form expanding until it filled the entire chamber. Emily's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the bell, its glow pulsating in rhythm with the tolling. The shadows seemed to reach for them, tendrils of darkness curling around their legs and arms. "We need to leave," Alice screamed, struggling against the shadows that held her in place. "No," Maggie said firmly. "If we run now, we'll never escape. We have to face it." The truth revealed. Emily's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. The shadow's words echoed in her head. "You have stolen our time. Evelyn," she said suddenly. "This is about Evelyn." The shadow froze, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Speak her name again, and you will know suffering." Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. "Evelyn is the key to all of this, isn't she? You're keeping her trapped." "She is ours," the shadow hissed. "She belongs to the tower." "No," Emily said, her voice rising with determination. "She doesn't belong to anyone. You're using her pain, to fuel whatever this is." The shadow let out a deafening roar, and the bell glowed brighter, its light blinding. The room shook violently, and cracks began to spiderweb across the walls. Emily braced herself against the onslaught, her resolve unshaken. "We're going to free her," she said, her voice steady. "No matter what it takes." The escape. The shadow surged forward, its form engulfing the room. Maggie shouted a command, her voice sharp and commanding, and the bell's glow dimmed for just a moment. It was enough. "Run!" Maggie yelled. The group bolted down the staircase, the shadow's furious roars echoing behind them. The tower shook with every step they took, chunks of stone falling around them. By the time they reached the bottom, the tolling of the bell had ceased, and the castle was silent once more. Emily collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Maggie knelt beside her, her face pale but determined. "We've angered it," Maggie said quietly, "but we've also revealed its weakness." Emily nodded, her mind racing. The shadow's connection to Evelyn was clear now. and she was more determined than ever to uncover the truth and break the curse.